It's April 19th, 2021. This is Roqe. With the beginning of a new Persian century in the year 1400, maybe it's time to look back, way back, and ask some questions about who we were before these last 1400 years, or more specifically, before Islam. What was Iran, and who were Iranians prior to 650 AD? And what are the threads of continuity for those of us of Iranian descent today? Is any peacocking deserved, or should we be more reserved? A feature conversation with historian, scholar, and writer Richard Foltz, an expert in the history of Iranian civilization. Richard Foltz coming up, plus your letters about Farmaz Aslani. This is Conversations from, to, and about the Iranian diaspora. I'm Jian Gameshi. This is Roqe. Hi there, welcome to episode number 103 of Roqe, coming to you from Toronto, Canada, with a salute to all of you joining us from around the world. Khosh omadin, welcome, durud bar shama. امیدوار هستم که میزون باشین. We are on an ongoing mission to build a new audiovisual encyclopedia of Iranian diaspora identity. You can find us on SoundCloud, Spotify, Instagram, YouTube, iTunes, Castbox, and Telegram. Hello to you, the fabulous Kian.
Hello, Jian.
Hello, Captain Reza.
Hello, sir.
And hello, Groovy Shaya.
Hi.
You've never been that enthusiastic in your life for anything. What's happened to you? What have you been eating, doing?
He's speaking hi.
He's
Not even Salah. Hi.
Hi. He's usually, hello. Professor Richard Foltz about to join us. I'm excited for this. I've just read two of his books in preparation, including his latest book, A History of the Tajiks, Iranians of the East. Apparently the first book ever to go this deep into the history of the Tajik people. You know, there's a lot that Iranians say about how great our history is. Some of it, you know, it intersects with our
Which it is.
It's all Persian to us
Yes.
segments, you know, especially before the Arab invasion and Islam.
Yeah.
We say, oh, we have this great civilization. Let's put it to the expert. Let's ask Richard Foltz about this. I have so many questions for him, albeit elementary ones to begin with. Just who were we? What are the threads of continuity? What was Iran? How do we explain some of our peacocking? Is it deserved? All of that. So very much looking forward to this. Richard Foltz joining us in just a few moments on the line from Quebec. In the coming days on Roqe, by the way, Peter Banifaz coming up on Thursday.
It's going to be good.
He's an Iranian-American actor. He's a comedic actor as well. I mean, he does comedy. And recently on his Instagram, he's been doing these little videos during the pandemic of a dad and a son, a Persian dad. And he plays both, you know. What I love about him too is he doesn't put on. There's no costume or anything. Like, he's just the same guy. He just kind of puts a shawl on, and that's his dad. But he plays this like ornery Persian dad, you know, yelling at. It's very fun.
It's the best. He's
really
my favorite.
Good. Oh yeah,
he's just truly captures the essence of dysfunctional Persian families.
Yes. He's doing it, and it's really catching on. I mean, these videos are going viral. So Peter Banifaz joining us on Thursday. Next Monday, a very special conversation with Bahman Globadi, the great filmmaker. That's a week from today. I'm so very much looking forward to speaking with him. In the coming days as well, Persian yoga and piyaz miyaz. So this is a guy named Masoud Mosai, who I guess is better known now as Piyaz Miyaz. He's an entrepreneur. He's an Iranian-Canadian fellow who's in Vancouver. his mission is he's always been interested in cuisine and cooking. He says I'm not an expert. I'm not a formally trained chef, but he's very accessible. He's attractive. And I don't know why. I don't know why I'm looking at you. I can look at Shaya. He's attractive, Shaya.
Okay.
And his mission is to bring Persian cuisine to the world and do it with his own little twist. And it's a great brand, pre-Islamic. And it's taken off. It's taken off during COVID when everybody's online looking for things. Yeah. So he will be joining us.
I like his insight on our Clubhouse, actually.
Yeah. I was just going to say
that's right. He joined us on Clubhouse last Friday when we were talking about where his home. What did he say? Do you remember?
He said
since you liked his insight,
the home is the place that you smell ghormeh sabzi.
There was a self-serving comment on his part. It's a part of his brand to be promoting ghormeh sabzi. But listen, so since I've been researching Piaz Miaz, he's had an effect on me because he is a big fan of intermittent fasting.
Okay.
Like he's been doing that for so as of 3 days ago. I started intermittent fasting.
I tried that for a while.
Yeah.
It
because of Ramadan, or
well, not because of Ramadan, but I'll take it. I mean, if anybody wants to think it's because of Ramadan, that's fine too. No, it's for health reasons, because he makes the case that not just for watching your weight or something, but that the body benefits from a long period of fasting after. So intermittent fasting is, at least as I'm doing it, or I'm trying it. I mean, this might last until tomorrow.
A few weeks from
I don't know.
Go on.
But you go 16 hours of fasting, and then you eat for 8 hours, as much as you want, and then you go 16 hours.
So which times are you gonna?
So I'm kind of having my last meal at around 8:30 p.m.
Okay.
So the next day at 12:30 I can start eating again.
Oh, that's not bad.
Yeah.
That's what I was.
So I in between you can have water. Coffee.
Delicious.
But anyway, my point about this is that so I got that from Piaz Miaz.
Okay.
So if it's a failure, I'll blame him. If it changes my life, by the time of our interview, I'll be thanking him. But I got this app. This was stupid. I went on the App Store and
Which
I was
one
like,
is it?
well, I don't want to say what it is
Okay.
because I don't want to promote it because I don't know if it's good or bad. It's only been a few days.
Okay.
But I did get an app and what these apps, I mean, it reminds me of Clubhouse. Have you noticed that being on Clubhouse means you get a notification every friggin' 20 minutes?
I had to turn it off.
I've tried. I keep going on Clubhouse. I keep going infrequent as possible.
Just turn it off.
And it just keeps telling me Keon is in this room. Chef Haas is in in his 30th room today. I'm just like, stop talking. So now I've got this. It's enough that Clubhouse keeps ringing my phone. Now I've got this intermittent fasting app. And this thing is, I mean, they've programmed this thing to be so enthusiastic that it's just over the top. Like, I don't need this level of enthusiasm. So it's like, you are 90 minutes into your fast. It's like, dude, it's okay. I made it through the first hour. Thank you. You've just made 2 hours into your fast.
God.
Drink some water. And I don't know how to turn it off. It just keeps talking to me. I want to just I might start eating just to deny the enthusiasm of this app.
You can control all this, by the way. I had the same app.
I just don't know how to. I haven't figured out how to control it yet. It's controlling me. Every couple of minutes, it's telling me it's been another few minutes that you've been fasting. It's like, I don't need you. And it reminds me that I'm hungry, when it keeps telling me these things. It's like, I wouldn't think about it. But when it goes, oh, now you made 2 hours fasting. It's like, oh, do I want a muffin right now?
And it reminds me when I used to fast or take a fast on Ramadan.
Fast,
When I used to fast on Ramadan, in the morning, you have to stop eating from the morning azan, the
call to prayer.
Yeah. So, and the radio announced it frequently, like, سحرخیزان عزیز تا اذان مغرب 5 دقیقه مانده. So you have to
gorge. Yeah. You know what somebody told me, actually, that upon telling them that I'm doing this intermittent fasting, they were saying, but in Ramadan, a lot of people get fat.
Yes, that's
true?
right.
That surprised me.
I've heard the opposite.
No, apparently you put on, I guess because you're eating before you sleep, right?
Oh.
Or something.
Exactly.
Right.
You eat actually, yes, in the middle of night, you eat something, then you go to sleep, and again at the night, you eat a lot, and
But
so
These are not absolutes, by the way. If you're listening and you're currently fasting for Ramadan, we don't know. I mean, you maybe you're losing weight.
But I
Who
would
knows
think
what's
the opposite.
happening?
Your appetite decreases, and in turn, your stomach is smaller. So don't you take more
that
food?
makes sense also.
Okay,
Yeah.
who knows?
Well, yeah, and also this thing about the intermittent fasting is, and then for those 8 hours, eat whatever you want as much as you. And I don't know if that's really.
Do you do that?
Wow, yeah. So far, I'm like, okay. I think I've gained 6 pounds for the last 3 days just eating whatever I want for those 8 hours. No, you know what it is though. I think what these things, the reason they work is because it just makes you conscious of your eating habits. So all of a sudden, I'm not eating late at night. My thing is like, it's before I go to bed, I'll have a peanut butter sandwich or something, and now I'm not doing that because the app is reminding me
90
that I have
minutes
to
into your
fast. So maybe that's it. What happened to you? You didn't want to do it?
It was good for a while, but then, man, the weekend comes around. You're like, screw this intermittent fasting.
But I think
It's
you
very-
can have a cheat day, can't you? Or,
I don't know. If you're doing it right, I don't think you're
Right.
supposed to. But
No, yeah.
But it
I don't
is very
know. And
useful.
also, like, how is it going to work with once we get back after COVID? Like at Persian Mahmounis, the food comes out at 1 a.m.
Exactly.
How am I going to have my 16 hours of fasting?
That's the other thing. Like, you can't eat on
I have to
forever.
continue quarantining to not eat.
Yeah.
I don't know.
But no, it's good. It's good to do once in a
We'll
while.
see. Who knows? But anyway, I'll probably stick with it for a couple of days. I don't know how long it'll last. To be honest, the only thing right now that's annoying me about this is this app that keeps talking to me and telling me how great I'm doing. If that's the only reason I would stop right now, to be able to delete this thing. But if you have any tips for me out there, you can let us know on any of our platforms or info@roqemedia.com. If you're a fan of the show, if you listen to us regularly, our website is roqemedia.com, and you can become a patron where you sign up for $5 or $10 a month. It means a lot to us as we crowdfund this to resource the show. So roqemedia.com, just press the support us button. We notice it when you guys become patrons, and we really appreciate it. And we're working on a special mail out that goes to the patrons, Jian.
Do explain.
Well, I'm not going to right now, but we will get to it. It is Monday, and we have letters.
Yeah.
What are we talking about today?
Farmaz
Yeah,
Aslani.
that's right.
We have quite a pile of letters from that interview.
All right, we will get to those. Captain Reza, Groovy Shaya, Fabulous Kian, strap yourselves in. Let's get to our featured guest. Nowruz has just passed not too long ago, and it's a big year, a new millennium in the Persian calendar, the year 1400. And we thought this might be a good opportunity to explore what the Iranian identity, culture, and civilization was before 1400 years ago, or more specifically, perhaps, in a pre-Islamic era. My featured guest today is an acclaimed cultural historian specializing in the broader Iranian world, encompassing societies from the Balkans to India and China. Dr. Richard Foltz is a Canadian scholar of American origin. He is a specialist in the history of Iranian civilization, what is sometimes called the Great Iran. He also worked extensively in environmental ethics and animal rights. Richard holds a PhD in Middle Eastern history from Harvard University. He also has a degree in Persian literature and applied linguistics from the University of Utah. He has taught at Kuwait University, Brown University, Columbia, and the University of Florida, and he is currently a professor of religions and cultures at Concordia University in Montréal. Richard also worked for several years in Europe as a musician, a film critic, and a travel writer. He is the author of 11 books and over 100 scholarly articles. His work has appeared in more than 10 languages. His most recent books are A History of the Tajiks, Iranians of the East, and Iran in World History. And right now, Professor Richard Foltz joins me from Quebec today. Hello, sir.
Hello.
It's nice to have you. I say Quebec, by the way, because even though you are a professor in Montreal, I know that you're in some beautiful, quiet, rural place right now. One of the strange fringe benefits of a deadly pandemic, I suppose.
Yes. They took the opportunity provided by this distance teaching, this online teaching, and we could be where we like to be. it's nice to be out of the city while all this is going on.
Surely, although Montreal is a beautiful city to live in. Richard, let me start with you, because you're an interesting guy. I mean, you self-identify as an Iranologist. Do you remember, you're clearly, I'm guessing, not Iranian in terms of your own ethnic or national background. Do you remember when you first became seduced by all things Iran and wanted to immerse yourself in Persian civilization, culture, and history?
Well, it was I suppose you could say, a rapid seduction preceded by a bit of unforeseen groundwork. I always loved the art, architecture, and music and food of medieval northern India. So I liked to eat in Indian restaurants. I listened to Hindustani music. I loved Mughal miniature paintings and Mughal architecture. And I just, I thought that I liked India. Then around 1986, on a visit to my parents in Salt Lake City, I met an Iranian fellow, which led to meeting eventually pretty much every Iranian in Salt Lake City. And as I got immersed in Persian culture, I realized that everything I liked about India actually came from Iran. And that made me curious. I want to go back to the source. I want to see what, I want to learn about the original. And it just so happened that, what was intended to be a month-long visit to my parents ended up lasting 2 years because my visit coincided with the beginning of an 8-week summer intensive Persian language course at the university, one of only 2 universities in the United States that had such a program. And I thought, well, let me just, check this out. I'll stay an extra month, and I'm meeting all these Persians, so it's an opportunity to practice what I'm learning. And to make a long story short, one thing led to another, and 35 years later, here I am, making a living at it. So not complaining.
The seduction is complete. There is something I wonder about. When you say you've been doing this for 35 years, I imagine you have a perspective on this question, which is that, is there some kind of advantage to not being Iranian and doing the kind of work you do? I am reminded of an interview we did on this program last year with Andrew Scott Cooper about his book on the Shah. And he said that when he was doing his research, when he was doing his interviews, that his subjects, those he was interviewing, predominantly Iranians, many in Iran, for example, were sometimes more open and candid with him because, to put it sort of bluntly, they didn't feel like he had any kind of horse in the race, if you will. Have you encountered that?
I've encountered many things over the years. It would be really difficult to sort of pull out of that miasma of experience what would be the dominant version. I don't know. There are advantages and disadvantages to being an outsider, but especially I can say over time, I was, Iranian damad for 28 years. So I figure I'm probably about 15 to 20% Iranian now, just by osmosis.
Right.
There are things about my character and my outlook now that can only be traced to the influence of being around Iranians and spending a lot of time in Iran. So I don't know if I can even claim to have the outsider's objectivity anymore.
But surely you must be considered a curiosity at some forums.
Yes.
or in some places where they look at you and go, okay, this white guy from Utah named Richard is knows more about our background than we do.
Well, I don't know if I know more, but I study things and you acquire information. And I do have, sort of dual perspective, I suppose. What's funny is, like in Iran, if I go to visit a historical site, they have dual pricing, Iranian pricing and foreigners pricing. So I always go up to the ticket window and I ask them in Persian, for a ticket, and they kind of look at me like, Shema Irani hasti? And I say, well, Shema chi fik mikuni, And I'm about 50-50 on that. About 50% of the time they give me the Iranian price and 50% they give me the foreigner's price.
Right. Let me just turn it around, though, as well, and say, as you would know, especially in academia, we live in a moment of sensitivity, surely around cultural appropriation and identity. Do you ever get confronted about speaking for Persians? I know that's not your intention, but has that ever been
happened to me? And it hasn't happened to me, and probably because I'm always quite forthcoming about the fact that I do not speak for Persians. I have never pretended to be in a position to illuminate, the Persian point of view. I present myself as an outsider and as a sympathetic outsider, and Iranians are very, very appreciative of that. Iranians, of course, are probably rivaling the French for the world's leading chauvinists, and so the best way into an Iranian's heart is to show how much you love their culture, and that's not true of all people. That's not true of all peoples. So I really appreciate it. I really appreciate the welcome that I've always had in Iranian homes and Iranian environments. But it's because right away, when Iranians see that you appreciate their culture, then they warm up to you.
Until you would advance a thesis or an opinion they don't like. That can sometimes...
I've never really gotten into a serious argument with an Iranian because they're so polite with foreigners, and maybe that's one of the advantages.
There's the advantage.
They won't, get down and dirty with me in that sense. So, they will, say, well, ikhtiyar darin, we will agree to disagree on that one.
Right.
So, yeah.
Let me get into this then, and you'll forgive me in advance if I ask some very basic questions, because if there's something I don't know about, it's history before 1400 years ago. So I come to you as a child looking for wisdom, and we do want to go way back. I mean, this conversation, it's interesting because it's kind of refreshing to not be debating what happened in the 20th century, but what Iranians are and who we are dating back thousands of years. So let me start with something very general. Iran gets talked about as being the nexus of East and West, situated at the crossroads. You often hear that, situated at the crossroads geographically, historically. But is it fair to say that Iran has culturally been situated at the crossroads of East and West as well?
I think that it depends on what you're talking about. I think that if you're going to talk about, say, the Silk Road as a conduit for cultural transmission over the centuries, you've got China on the one end and you've got the Mediterranean on the other end, and Iran is at the nexus of that. And it was Iranians, mostly Sogdians, who were Iranians, but Iranians who were the principal agents of this cultural exchange along the Silk Road throughout all of these centuries. I mean, China is trying to tell a different story right now. I'm maybe going to try to write a book to sort of counter that, recenter the Silk Road, as it were, where it belongs. But in that sense, you could say that Iran is a nexus. But in my book, which you mentioned before, Iran and World History, which was absolutely written for people who don't know anything about Iran, and it was pleasant to see that it was actually translated twice in Iran in two different Persian editions. So, it's always gratifying when Iranians find interest in what I'm doing. But I want to make clear, I never pretended to teach Iranians about their own culture. That's not my aim, and I don't have the capacity to do it. My aim has been to open the eyes of Westerners to aspects of Iran's contribution to history that they may be unaware of. So my intended audience is absolutely Westerners and not Iranians. And in this book, I take the approach of saying that as Westerners, it's important for us to understand, because we tend to trace our civilization, rightly or wrongly, back to ancient Greece and Rome. And if Greece and Rome are the foundations of Western civilization and Western identity, then I think it really behooves us to recognize and accept and to value the fact that this development of a self-conscious Western identity could only emerge through interaction with the mirror of the other, which was precisely Persia.
Right.
It was, it was through interactions with Iran that the Greeks and later on the Romans defined who they were. We are not them. And in other words, Western identity could not exist as it does without that Iranian mirror. And that's something that is rarely, if ever, talked about in Western civilization courses or discussions. And I just wanted to sort of bring that onto the table.
Well, I was going to say you've talked about it, but let me get to that. I just want to stick with this East and West delta or paradox in a sense, because when it comes to self-identity, it occurs to me there's something interesting here, which is that Iranians are distinctly Eastern. I mean, Iran is situated in Asia. If you look at the whole world, a map, and yet Iranians often identify more with Western Europe in some ways. I guess this is just one of the many paradoxes when it
a certain kind of Iranian does. I think, especially from the 20th century onwards, even probably going back to the 19th century, when a lot of wealthy Iranian families started sending their sons off to France and Germany to get educated. I think that a certain class of Iranians tends to identify as Western. But I don't think that's necessarily true for Iranian society as a whole. Still, there is a different treatment, a different view of the West that one sees in Iran across the society, across all classes. And I've been reminded of that by some of my Afghan students, for example, when I talk in class about how Iranians are, so xenophilic. They really love foreigners. They really love guests.
Right.
It's famous for being such a hospitable country. And my Afghan students will say, well, that's your experience as a Westerner. That's not our experience as Afghans.
Right. Yes.
And which is interesting because Afghans are actually, historically the same people as the Persians in so many ways. But I'm not going to try to explain that. But
if you were to getting into this question of the roots of Iranians and Iran, if you were to, in a nutshell, explain it, how should we view Iranian culture and civilization in the pre-Islamic era? How would you describe it simply?
Well, I begin my discussions of Iranian civilization about 2000 BCE for the very simple pragmatic reason that we have access to some data which indicates that there was something present at that time that we could characterize as an Aryan self-identity. And of course, Iranian means Aryan. That's etymologically, it's, the word, it's reconstructed in historical linguistics. Aryo is probably close to the form that existed 4,000 years ago. And it was clearly a self-designation. And it probably meant something like, we the noble people.
Right.
So our group, our people, are more noble than other people, and that's us. And that's what Arya means. And so that is a term that continues to appear in different forms and different contexts in different parts of the world right up to the present day. And of course, and nowadays it's contaminated by, its abuse by the Nazis in the 1930s. So we have to sort of bracket that, set that aside, say that's a special case. We're not talking about that. But the word has a legitimate history, Aryan, and I think that it's legitimate to use it as a synonym for Iranian because it's the same word in terms of etymology. So what are some of the things that enable us to go back 4,000 years and to actually locate it geographically in the southern Ural Mountains?
4,000 years or 3,000 years?
4,000 years ago. I wouldn't push it back more than about 4,200 years ago. There's a civilization that existed for about 400 years in the southern Ural Mountains region of what's now Russia, Western Siberia and the very eastern extremes of Europe, north of the Caspian Sea. And this region was inhabited by a people over the course of about 4 centuries that archaeologists refer to as the Sintashta people or the Sintashta Archaim people. And this is, archaeologists always name cultures after locations where they find a certain, set of cultural relics that, that seem to constitute a culture. So there are things about the archaeology of this region which enabled us to suspect very strongly what their linguistic identity was. And some of this goes through from comparative linguistics and comparative mythology. So if we take, for example, the Avesta and the Rig Veda, so these are 2 texts that represent 2 peoples with a common history, with a common ancestry. One of them wound up in Iran, the other wound up in India. So if we say that the split probably occurred somewhere around 3,500 years ago, then these texts probably started to emerge in the forms we have them today a few centuries after that, once the dialects had started to diverge. So we compare both the language itself and what the language tells us. So for example, in historical linguistics, you have something called isoglosses. So you take a word and you can plot that word on a map historically. You can say, the word for birch tree. Well, it certainly originated in a region that had birch trees, You wouldn't think, that the word for palm tree originates in Siberia, that if you find the word for palm tree in Russian is going to be a loan word from some language of a people who live in a place where there are palm trees.
Okay.
So the reverse is also true. So when we find that the word for birch tree is common to all Indo-European languages, that suggests that the original ancestors of all these, sister languages lived in a place with birch trees. So you draw that on a map. You draw a line around the regions and then you do that for all these different words, and you get a narrow and narrower, sort of territory that can kind of, pinpoint where speakers of a particular language lived at a certain point in history. So that takes us there in one sense. But then you add to that comparative mythology. One of the most interesting examples is horse sacrifice, what's called in the Rig Veda the Asvamedam. And, horse sacrifice is not very common in India because you can't really raise horses there. It was always a bad place to raise horses. They had to bring them from Central Asia. But the horse sacrifice is really important in the Rig Veda, and it gives you the description of how you do it. Now, they found burials in this Sintashta region, the southern Urals, dating to about 4,000 years ago, which clearly have followed the prescriptions for horse sacrifice that are spelled out in the Rig Veda. So that, again, it's another way of tying this to this Proto-Aryan culture.
So, the thing like the horse sacrifices is not something that we relate to today. In as much as we take pride in Iranian civilization and culture dating back thousands of years, you have identified 3 threads of continuity, things that we know of today or that we consider that we can identify immediately as Iranians, that are this continuity stream that go back thousands of years, but are also, as you've talked about, problematic in their own way as well. And the 3 are language, land, and the Persian literary tradition, specifically the Shahnameh. And I want to explore these 3 threads of continuity, if you will. Let's start with language.
Yes. So Persian is a member of the Iranian language family, which is itself a subgroup of the Indo-European language family. So, distantly related to English and French and Russian, Armenian, and much more closely related to Hindi and Bengali languages of India, because as I mentioned, Avestan and Vedic were very, very closely related languages going back to the 2nd millennium BCE. And of course, Persian is not the only Iranian language spoken today. It's the best known, but Kurdish is spoken by 30-40 million people. That's an Iranian language, actually very close to Persian. Baluchi in Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan, Pushtun, which is spoken by millions and millions of people in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and many, many smaller languages, such as those found in the valleys of the Pamir Mountains in Tajikistan, and also in the Caucasus Mountains, in the Central Caucasus, where I've been living and working a lot of the last 2 years. The Assets are speakers of an Iranian language distantly related to Persian.
Is that why it's problematic? Because Persian doesn't represent all Iranians? Because
yes, this is the point. And after I published this book on the Tajiks, because they've been subjected first to 70 years of Soviet nationalist propaganda, followed by 20 years of Tajik nationalist propaganda, and they've completely lost touch with historical reality in terms of who they are and where they come from. And actually, many Tajiks are offended when you call them Iranians, and which is ridiculous, because Tajiks, they speak Persian. It's the same language, and they have basically the same cultural history right up until 1747. As recently as 1747, Samarkand and Bukhara, belonged to Nader Shah's empire. So, but that gets lost amongst the nationalist diatribes today. So, but Iranian is the broader category. And when I call myself an Iranologist, I'm interested in everything Iranian.
Right.
Persian is a much, much narrower category, but it's the most famous one. It's the best known, starting with the Achaemenid Empire, which is often referred to as the Persian Empire. So that connection between Greece and Persia, is the beginning of this sort of dominance of the Persian aspect of Iranian civilization in the Western psyche.
So do you think it's fair that we see? I mean, I bring this up because it gets said a lot. Like, it's been said to me a whole bunch. But we have the Persian language. It is much before the Arabs. Like, it's like we had this thing, and then and this is the way we can see our thread way before Islam, way before the Arabs came. And is it fair to embrace the Persian language that way?
Well, it's a beautiful language with a great and noble history, so why not? I mean, I'm proud that it's one of the 3 languages I speak fluently. It's got such a rich tradition. I'm always telling my students when they say, "Oh yeah, I read a book by Rumi. It's so good," and I say, "Well, you didn't read a book by Rumi because you read it in English. If you want to read a book by Rumi, you have to learn Persian."
Okay, so the only flag on the play is that just don't think it represents all Iranians, because there are other.
It doesn't. Right. It doesn't. But the Shahnameh, which was one of the sort of cultural polls that you mentioned.
Yes.
I think goes deeper. Well, before we get away from Persian, we can say most Iranians don't speak Persian, or most Iranians historically have not spoken Persian, but most have known about it and respected it as a kind of linguistic role model.
Wait, most Iranians haven't spoken Persian?
Yeah, most Iranian peoples.
What were they speaking?
If you're talking about Ossets or Baluch or whatever, these are Iranian peoples, or even Kurds, if you add up all the speakers of Iranian languages today, I wouldn't say that Persian speakers are more than half of the total.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
But my point is that whereas the average Iranian might not know anything about Ossetian, well, the average Ossetian definitely knows about Persian and definitely knows that Ossetians are Iranians. So I think that the Persian language does have this prestige, and it's seen in the literary traditions of all the neighboring peoples, from the Balkans, from the Albanians to the Uyghurs, including the Bengalis. Their literary traditions up to modernity are calqued upon Persian norms. They are, even writers who didn't know Persian wrote in their own language in a Persian way, according to Persian literary norms. So the Persian language, in that sense, has a status and a prestige that I think, in the last 150 years, it's waned dramatically, as we see French waning now. The French don't want to accept that it's not the language that it was 100 years ago, the language of international diplomacy. But before that, it was Persian. Marco Polo spoke Persian, because that was the language an Italian businessman who wanted to, do business on the Silk Road needed to learn it. The British, when they colonized India, they set up these chairs of Persian at Oxford and Cambridge to train civil servants, because if you were a young, ambitious Englishman who wanted to go make your career in India, you had to learn Persian to get a job, to go and work there. And that was up until 1837 when they switched to the official language to Urdu.
Let me segue to the literary tradition that you mentioned, because that's a big one. And that's one that we regularly will cite. Most Iranians will say Rumi, Hafez, and then Omar Khayyam, and of course the Shahnameh. And this is something that we see as a thread of continuity through the centuries, through the thousands of years. What's problematic about that? Anything?
Well, there's nothing inherently problematic about, being a culture which is literature centered. I rather admire it. I'm a person who loves literature, and I bemoan the fact that we're increasingly entering a post-literate world where people don't read. So I really admire this about Iranian culture, that literature is so much at the very center of it. So I don't really find a problem with that. But of course, I think what you're maybe hinting at is that Iranians are prone to exaggeration, and I don't think anybody would deny that. And one aspect of that can be maybe to project things too far into the past. Persian literature is truly one of the great literary traditions, that humanity has produced. But it started in the Islamic period, and it was built upon Arabic literary norms. Okay, all these great Persian poets, they started writing poetry based on the very sophisticated oral traditions of the Bedouin Arabs, and they were just doing it in Persian instead of Arabic. And the poetry that we have in Middle Persian from before that there's not much of it that's survived, but it's not that good. So if you're going to talk about literature as, source of national pride, do it, but, give it its proper starting point, which is basically the 10th century.
You talk about Ferdowsi himself being a Muslim, right?
Yes, a Muslim who made his lasting fame by collecting pre-Islamic heroic stories that celebrate the pre-Islamic period, and this great epic which ends in absolute tragedy, which is the coming of Islam. So there's a real irony there. It's a Muslim poet is working for Muslim patrons, for a Muslim audience, basically presenting Islam as the end of civilization instead of the start of civilization.
Right. I want to come back to that. It's too rich. And you've written a fair bit about that. I want to come back to that. Let me just come to that third thread of continuity and whether you see it as legitimate, or where you see that maybe I should rephrase why is that problematic, and just say what are the complexities of seeing these as threads of continuity. Land has been something that we use as a source of continuity.
Iran is, throughout most of history, it's an idea. It didn't become, we could say, a political entity as we see it today until 1935, when Reza Shah declared, on the advice of his Nazi sympathizing ambassador in Berlin, that it would be good to emphasize Iran's Aryan origins. And so he declared that henceforth the country would not be known as Persia, but it would be known as Iran in international diplomacy. Because before that, everybody called it Persia. That's not to say that the idea of Iran wasn't present in the minds of Iranians. It was, but it's an idea, the idea of Iran. So Iran nabashad taniman nabad, this is an idea. It's not something physical and concrete. And that's what, to me, is really unique and interesting about the notion of Iranianness. It's an affinity. It's an affinity. It's not. That's why I say, I can consider myself maybe 15 to 20% Iranian now, because I have this affinity or this idea of Iran, which I've absorbed, and people all over the world have absorbed that. In Albania, I met this Albanian journalist in Montréal at some art opening, and he started reciting Persian poetry to me, and I said, "How do you even know that?" He said, "Well, in Albania, it's part of our culture." I said, "What? Why is it part of your culture?" And of course, Nowruz is the example par excellence of this.
I want to come to Nowruz, but let me get to Nowruz. Just tell me about land, because land.
Yeah, land.
We do.
That's the problem, because there's this notion of Iran Zamin, the land of Iran, and it's got an earlier reflex, which is Aryanam Vayajam, which is the Avestan term, the land of the Aryans, but literally means the land of the noble, because Aryan means we, the noble people. So Aryanam Vayaja, and so that later, the later expression of that is, well, in Middle Persian it's Iran Vej, but today people say Iran Zamin. So, and for the average Iranian, I think that includes Kabul. I think that includes Samarkand and Bukhara. I think it includes Baghdad. Iran Zamin is not boundaried by the frontiers of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And that's what I'm always, telling my students. I'll show them a slide of the Middle East political borders today, and then I'll show them a slide of the extent of, the Iranian peoples, and they see that, it's a very, very different picture. And I think that when Iranians say the land of Iran, that's what they mean. But it's a feeling. It's a feeling. It's not a physical reality with established borders. And moreover, what's problematic is that in the earliest times, the physical land moved, because the Aryans were nomadic, and they changed their location. They started off in Western Siberia, and they moved into Central Asia, and then they moved into the South Caspian Plateau, and eventually Mesopotamia. So it's only been for the past, out of 4,000 some years of history, it's only been a little over half of that Iran has been where it is today, even as an idea.
Or forms of where it is, because it would expand and contract with the Persian Empire and all of that, right?
But let's just take note of the fact that the Persian literary tradition, which we talked about, which was developed in the 10th century, that took place in Bukhara, in Central Asia, what's now Uzbekistan. Not in Persia, not in Fars or Parsa. It wasn't Shiraz, it was Bukhara. And that's really significant.
That is.
I think.
The more this is turning into one of those, the more I know, the less I understand situations. As you continue to talk, I'm going,
that's the way it works.
Well, is it? I mean, it's so difficult, because when you're talking about Iran as an idea, I understand that has been said poetically many times. I've heard that, but you're talking about it in sort of a granular way. This is like, this is something that shapeshifts. It is confusing today as to who is and who is not an Iranian. Is it a person who lives in Iran? Is it a person like me whose parents and ancestry come from Iran? Is it a cultural mindset, an idea, as you're saying? And it begs the question, who were the original Iranians in the pre-Islamic era, and where do Zoroastrians and Kurds and Tajiks fit in?
Well, again, for me, they're all Iranians, and I think that much is to be gained by taking the more inclusive approach, and much is lost by doing the opposite. And I don't understand it. I don't understand these arguments over who can and cannot claim to be Iranian. Again, I think it's an affinity. It's an affinity, and if you feel that affinity, then you belong. You're part of it. And even people who don't know Persian, if they have a feeling for these many manifestations of Iranian culture, then they're part of something common, whether it's the music, or whether it's the food, or whether it's the politeness, or whether it's the hospitality, or whether it's the poetry. Whatever it is, if you have a feeling when you participate in it, then you're part of it. You're not a foreigner.
Who tends to make the argument about who can and can't be included?
Oh, they do. I remember when I was in graduate school, first there was a huge argument over whether to call the student organization the Harvard Persian Club or the Harvard Iranian Club. And then when they had elections, and this Afghan guy got elected president, there were all these people who were angry. He's saying he's not Iranian. He's from Mazar-e-Sharif. Well, I'm telling you, this guy, and he's a really well-known reporter for Voice of America. He could recite the Golistan from start to finish. Right. I mean, he could recite the Shahnameh. He put them all to shame when it came to who's a real Iranian. He could make gourmet sabzi to put to shame all of them. But it was an argument. They were saying, no, he can't be president.
Yeah.
He's from Afghanistan. So yes, these arguments occur. They break my heart. I don't understand them.
All right. Let me. And by the way, your book about the Tajiks is fascinating, and you're the first one who's really done that kind of an in-depth study as a contemporary historian. I've had the joy of cracking the covers on that, and I hope that more people continue to check it out. Let me go back again 3 steps to something you mentioned, which is Nowruz, and that is something else too that surely has been a major thread of continuity. Nowruz, you've written and talked about the cultural import of Nowruz, that it's more than just a holiday. Can you explain why?
It's an expression of membership in a community. It's an expression of identity. And again, it's something that goes so far beyond any definition of even Iranian, because it's an important holiday in the Balkans. It's an important holiday in Western Mongolia. I remember when I was a graduate student living in Uzbekistan, people got so excited about it, and they say it's our national holiday. It's a national Uzbek holiday. I'd say, oh, really? So why has it got a Persian name? And they'd say, what do you mean? And I'd say, well, how do you say, new day in Uzbek? And they'd say Yangi Kun. And I'd say, how come you call it Nowruz instead of Yangi Kun? And they couldn't answer that. But, they thought it's theirs. And, I don't think that it's even originally an Iranian holiday. I think it's something that the Persians got from the Mesopotamians. I think that prior to their contact with Mesopotamia, I think that the Iranians' major annual holiday was Mehragan in the fall. I think it was the harvest festival, not the planting festival as it were. But that's neither here nor there. It's become Iranian over the last 3,000 years. But so in a sense, maybe it's an Iranian cultural expression in the sense that whoever celebrates it is expressing this common affinity with all the other people who are celebrating it everywhere else in the world. It's a common partaking. And of course, you know as well as I do that for any Iranian, it is the event of the year.
Yes.
There's nothing that the Islamic Republic or anybody has been able to do to come up with an expression of identity that can come close to rivaling it.
What's interesting, Richard, is it's this interesting marriage of a celebration of a holiday, but there's a real sense of pride there too. We don't in the West have New Year's Eve on December 31st and feel pride in it, I guess maybe some people do with Christmas or Easter. I don't know, but there's real pride involved with Nowruz.
It's a real joyous occasion, and and Shiism is basically a culture of mourning. So there's a paradox there, that I am often, trying to explain to people, but because people tend to think, oh, Iranians, they must be really pessimistic and negative. And I say, no, they're the most life-embracing culture. They love to have fun. Well, boy, it doesn't look that way, in these Moharram celebrations. Well, there's more to the picture than that. But that really comes out, of course, starting, with Charshanbe Suri and going on for 3 weeks. You just got, it's just a nonstop party. And, whatever it is, it's one of the most essential ingredients in Iranianness that one could think of.
Richard, there's something you said a few minutes ago, or at this point it might be about 20 minutes, half an hour ago, that I would be remiss if I didn't bring back to the conversation, because it's so interesting, and it's something that you've written about, I know, where you talked about Iranian civilization vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And it may be counterintuitive to some people that Iranian civilization, you've argued, has had an important impact and influence on the formation of Western civilization as we know it. I'm wondering if you can give examples of that. Without being ridiculous about it, what do we see in Western civilization that would have come as a mirror, an attempt to mirror, as you said, Iranian civilization?
Yeah, again, you define who you are by saying, I'm not that, right? So, but, the Greeks, they weren't entirely negative about the Persians. They had some positive things to say. And, I mean, the Persians invented the world's first postal service, and and the first knotted pile rug, and a lot of other things. But basically, if you read ancient Greek texts, I mean, I did as part of my general education, growing up. Well, they're always comparing themselves with the Persians. I mean, take any text, and there's going to be some comment. It's like, well, the Persians do it this way, we do it that way, and the examples are endless. But it's always there. The Persians are always there, sort of on the other side of the border, and they're the presence. It's not anybody else. I mean, sometimes it's the Scythians, who are also Iranians. But overwhelmingly, it's the Persians. Whatever the Greeks are talking about themselves and what's normal and what's right, they give the example of the Persians, and then they say, and then this is how we do it. And the Persians are the point of comparison.
By the way, you're of American heritage and you've been teaching in Canada. You know how Canadians self-identify, right?
Yeah, we're not. Well, I live in Quebec, which is a different story. And
okay, that's a whole other thing. Yeah,
for that reason.
The answer is not American. Is where I was going with that. You can't really get a Canadian beyond some sort of tacky sort of symbols, the beaver or the hockey stick or something, to really identify what being Canadian is, other than we're not American.
Yes.
The fact that we as Iranians have this rich history and impact on civilization is a point of pride for many Iranians. And I have to go here with you and see, just to try it out on you. But I mean, some of these folks who wear this with such pride would also not be caught dead being linked to the nation state of Iran currently, the way it's being run and ruled. And yet there is this superiority complex about the past. From where you sit, are Persians justified in so-called peacocking? I mean, promoting ourselves based on our past, or is this just a way to come to terms with the negativity around how Iran is seen today?
Well, it's probably both. I mean, I think that pride it can be a good thing up to a point, but then there's a point at which it's excessive, and there are times when it is, by virtue of being clearly unjustified, it becomes a basis for ridicule, and I think it's wise to avoid that. But again, I think that Iranians have a lot to be proud of, like the French have a lot to be proud of. But what has France contributed to global civilization lately? I mean, how long has it been since the croissant was invented? But still, some nations have perhaps a stronger claim to greatness than others. And because Iranians have a very, very long history going back thousands of years, I mean, as a North American, I can only stand in awe of what that must feel like, because, I've done my own genealogical research, and I really can't go back more than 150 years, and basically to losers, who were running away from Europe and looking, for a place that nobody knew them. So I don't have much of a past to be proud of, and so I'm in a sense envious of people who do. But the past is one thing, and the present is another. Of course, North Americans are very forward-looking, because we tend not to have a past. We look to the future. Right. And Iranians, like other, great nations, they tend to look to the past because they've got a lot of it to fall back on. And it can be a great comfort if you are, in despair over the present, the way things are. If you're pessimistic about the future, it's really comforting to be able to say, yeah, but at least I come from a great civilization with a great and proud history.
And yet you talk about, it's a beautiful segue, you talk about the essential ambivalence at the center of Iranian cultural identity. And I want to weave back the Shahnameh that you were talking about earlier, because it's such a rich idea what you put forward. I mean, there are those, we know them, I know, who believe that the last 1400 years, since the coming of the Arabs and Islam, have been a sullying of a once great Persian civilization. And the Shahnameh itself glorifies Iran's pre-Islamic past, as you said. And to quote you say, ends in disaster with Iran's glorious civilization being utterly destroyed by the barbarian Arabs. Was it all downhill after 650 BCE?
Well, I mean, it depends on, which team you're playing for, I suppose. But to the extent that I have studied the history of the development of Islam, which is not my specialization, but I've spent a fair amount of time looking at this aspect of Iranian history. It's quite abundantly clear that what we call the Islamic tradition today was shaped to a very large extent by people who were Iranians. The Arabs more or less were moved to the side of the scene within 100 years or so. Islam began as an Arab religion. It was called ad-Din al-Arab, the Arab religion, for 100 years under the Umayyad dynasty. But in 750, there was this massive revolution which came from Iran, which basically transformed Islam from an Arab religion into a multinational religion. So Iranians were the principal agents in doing that. And over the coming centuries, Muslims and non-Muslims alike who are not informed tend to imagine that everything in Islam is in the Quran, and that's simply not true. You've seen the Quran; it's not a very thick book, and there are many more things that are not addressed in the Quran than that are, and many of the things that are addressed in the Quran are really not that relevant to things outside 7th century Arabia. So where does all this massive tradition, this all-encompassing way of life come from? It was developed over a period of at least 300 to 400 years. And when you look at that formative period, you see the transformations and what was happening and the different forces that were interacting. And the Arabs played a fairly small role in that. Iranians were the predominant actors. So if we look at the result, what's come down to us today, that wasn't fully formed until about the 11th century. The primary actors were Iranians. So if you are an Iranian Muslim, you can take great pride in considering that Islam is a truly and authentically Iranian religion. And if you're one of these Iranian nationalists that abhors Islam and wants to distance himself, from Islam, well, you are going to have to deal with this reality that the Iranians so deeply implicated in what this religion became. And moreover, that you cannot escape the impact of this religion on all Iranians over the past 1,000 years. So I think the important thing is to be honest about that. But yes, it is a paradox, and it's problematic for a lot of people.
But as you say, it is both. It reminds me in a contemporary context of the debate in the United States, because America is so polarized that you'll, at any given time, depending on who the leader is, the previous one or the current one, that you'll have people going, that person does not represent America. And then you kind of go, well, actually half the country voted for that person, so they represent somebody, right?
Yes. That's absolutely true. And there's a real tendency amongst Iranians to sort of ignore large proportions of their own society. But that's not unique to Iranians. I mean, especially nowadays with globalization, we see that we all sort of exist in circles which are global and, transnational, and we actually have more in common and more interaction with other members of our circles in other parts of the world than we do with people in our own country and our own society who move in different circles. I think that to some extent, that's just a reality that we all live in today.
It is such a great pleasure, an honor, in fact, to get to talk to you and to listen to your pearls of wisdom. And I only wish that I could have you next to me throughout the day and ask you questions constantly. I thank you so much for doing this. I have one final question, or one final Rubik's Cube to put in front of you and see if you could untangle for us around this notion of paradoxes and how we grapple with identity and in the current context. And my poor sister, I invoke her often, but I have to mention, she's a professor professor of linguistics. And when we talk about language sometimes, and I know you're a linguist as well, so you'll relate to this. Sometimes when I come to her with something that's really bothering me in language, I'll say, this person used the grammar this way, or they said this word this way, or they pronounced it, or they wrote it like, she'll say, and she's supposed to be the expert, so I'm looking for some validation from her to set down these rigid rules. And she'll say, language is fluid. It keeps changing. It's evolving. You can't impose rules upon this, because it's going to keep evolving. And it reminds me of what I've read from you about identity, where you say that the Iranian identity, it's full of paradoxes. It's shape-shifting. It keeps evolving. It's somehow fluid. So how do we embrace something that keeps shifting, or is that just true of any culture?
We live in a dynamic universe, and maybe this is our predicament as conscious beings. We want to constantly grasp onto things that are slipping out of our grasp. This is why I suppose Buddhism has been such a successful philosophy, because, it's pretty much hit the nail on the head. And it's interesting that quantum physics is sort of now catching up with Buddhism in saying that there are no fundamental particles. It's just interactions and continuous transformation. So that's true of identity, as it's true of anything else. So what I tried to do in that book that you mentioned, was to try to tease out at least a few, you mentioned 3 threads that seem to have some continuity over several thousand years. So while the forms are constantly, as you say, shape-shifting, that maybe there's something kind of stringing along there that you can say, okay, that we can call it Iranian. And to the extent that one is connected to that, well, one is tapping into that identity.
It's been a great pleasure. I thank you for this today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Khudafis.
Khudafis. Richard Foltz, a professor of religions and cultures at Concordia University in Montreal. His most recent book is called A History of the Tajiks, Iranians of the East. Professor Richard Foltz joined us from Quebec today. Microphone's back on. Groovy Shia, Captain Reza, and the fabulous Key on the Roqe team, the Roqe on Air team are back here. I need to process that. I could have talked to him for another 5 hours. It was so interesting to me. There's so many things he said there that I am. So Persian is the minority language for Iranians. I mean, that's just like one of 100 things he said that are so interesting to me. And he, I should once again say, if you enjoyed that chat, first of all, I already want to bring him back, but do check out his books, because they're really interesting reads based on, and we just scratched the surface for the last hour, but really, really worth checking out. What an interesting guy, huh?
Yeah, I mean, I could have handled another 4 hours of that. I craved more. It was over, and I was like, no, I want more. But in general, the historians that come on the show, every time I'm just blown away. He brought up some interesting points that I never quite thought of this way, that without the mirror of Persia, Western civilization would have never existed, because the Greeks were always comparing themselves to Persians.
He actually has written a fair bit about that Western civilization owes a debt to Persia. It was created based on trying to be the antithesis of Persian civilization. I guess
I never thought of it that way, but it makes sense. And that the Persian language was a language of diplomacy. This is not spoken about in Western culture. I grew up here, so I don't, the education that I consume on Persian history comes from books that I read, from my family. So I want more of this. You don't know that the Persian language is the language of diplomacy when you listen to Captain Reza talk? Absolutely not. Quite the opposite when he speaks. Marco Polo spoke Persian, for God's sakes. This is so unknown to a lot of people.
Captain Reza, how'd you feel about this?
Well, just to piggyback on what the last thing Kian said, like that was one of the things that took me by surprise. Like Marco Polo spoke Persian just to be able, and he said that a lot of the Roman traders and merchants, like they did that, and they spoke like Persian back then. There were a couple of things that really
let that be a lesson to non-Iranians out there. If you want to get ahead in the world,
that's true. Yeah,
learn Farsi. It'll open doors for you.
Trust me, so many opportunities.
If only that had been the case for most of my life. But anyway, yeah.
True.
Yeah.
But there was a few other things, like one that he fell in love with when he was in India. Like he fell in love with anything Indian that was influenced by that had Persian influence. That was so fascinating to me, and just in general, like his honest and unbiased point of view on the Persian language and culture.
Yeah.
I loved it. I'm definitely going to go back and listen to it.
Listen to how excited we are that a white guy likes us. We're like, yes, he appreciates it. He's brilliant.
I think
he's brilliant.
It's because it validates what we already thought, and we think that this is because we're Persian, but you know,
But
when a white guy validates.
We found a guy who can validate for us.
Also, he had a very honest and well-researched and truthful point of view.
No, absolutely. I'm joking. I mean, he's a scholar. And he's knows what he's talking about. Shaija?
First of all, I trust non-Iranian historian. I trust more. I don't know why, because I think maybe they don't have any connotation of Iran. And so
as he said, no horse in the race kind of thing. He's not playing on anyone's team.
Yeah, but I really fascinated by the idea that how Iranian helps to spread Islam. It was fascinating for me that.
Yes,
and it makes sense for me when I found some similar roots between, let's say, Zoroastrian and Islam. It makes sense for me.
Not necessarily the Zoroastrians, but he actually has written a fair bit about this in particular, and the books that I mentioned. He spends a fair bit of time talking about the fact that the paradox of Iran, the Shahnameh, Iranians suggesting that Islam was the downfall of everything, but have been the exporters and exponents of proponents of Islam over centuries. That's something that we should probably bring him back for, or have a separate 100%. Conversation about, because that's very interesting, and it is certainly a point of tension in our community.
Exactly.
Do we embrace? I mean, there was that point in the interview. It was towards the end here. We were just doing it where we said. I was talking about you look at, depending on how you look at the United States, you go, can you believe that Trump became president? It's like, well, half the population voted for him, and there are still many people in Iran who embrace Islam. It isn't the thing for many of the folks in the urban centers, or in the maybe middle upper classes, who've come west. They see Iran in a different way, but at the end of the day, that is a big part of the Iranian story as well, right? Including you, Shaya. You come from a religious family.
I was going to say I was raised in a religious family, and most of them, they are still religious. Some of them, like me, we left our religion, but most of them are still embracing Islam, and
to be continued. To be continued. Very thought-provoking. I'd love to hear people's thoughts on this interview. You post on any of our platforms that you've listened to, or send us an email at info@roqemedia.com about Professor Richard Foltz. Really enjoyed that. All right. It's Monday. That can only mean one thing. Letters of the week.
Oh, God.
Headache already.
All right.
I get so excited for the letters, and then Captain Reza does his
just kills the vibe. Anyway, so about a week and a half
clears
ago.
the room. He clears the dance floor with that.
Oh, God, Reza, just for once, please, just mute.
I'll try.
All right, about a week and a half ago, for our 100th episode, we had the legendary Iranian-American singer-songwriter as well, Faramarz Aslani, on the show, the man with the satin voice.
Yes.
So I've been saving these letters. We've had quite a pile coming in. So on YouTube, we have username Go Eagles. I'm assuming he's a football fan.
Right.
Says, I found Faramars to be very honest and interesting. Had heard a few of his songs, but didn't know the singer. Excellent interview.
Nice.
And then we
Nice to have people discovering Faramars
yeah,
Aslani.
yeah, it's
That's interesting.
amazing.
Yeah.
And then we have Turaj Khosravi wrote, you did it again, Roqe. That was the best of the best episode indeed. Keep on doing the great job.
Oh, thank you, Turaj.
Very nice. On Facebook, we have Mojgan Bigdelo wrote, I fell in love and got addicted with his music when I heard Aghe Yeruzi in my early 20s. He sings directly from his heart to ours. He's amazing. Thank you, Jian, for the fantastic interview.
Thank you, Mojgan. Aghe Yeruz. Did she write Yeruzi?
Yeah, she wrote, is it, but it's
She's
saying
adding
like
some
Aghe
flavor.
Yeruzi, isn't it?
But it's called Aghe Yeruz. but
Okay.
That's okay.
But it's,
Yeah.
okay, cool.
We'll take it.
All right, on Instagram.
Thank you, though. A lovely comment.
On Instagram, we have Mariam Gul wrote, thanks to Jian and Roqe for all the wonderful interviews. Congrats on your 100th episode and to many, many more. Shout out to Jian. You are an amazing interviewer, especially this interview with one of my favorite musicians and songwriters.
Thank you. Who was that?
This was Mariam Gul.
Thank you, Mariam. That was so kind.
Yeah. And then we have Samira Talebi wrote, simple and beautiful poems that touch the heart. Today I realized how late I fell in love. I fell in love for the first time at age 26, and that's in reference to Faramars talking about his love story from age 6.
From 6 years
It
old,
was
yeah.
adorable.
I was wondering what that reference was. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. And she goes on saying, congrats on your 100th episode. Special thanks to Kian John for her exciting content in the It's All Persian to Us segments. Kian dare kam kam همه چیزا رو به نام ایران میزنه.
Nice.
I speak the truth.
That means Kian is slowly suggesting that everything came from Iranians.
Well, after today's interview, it kind of makes
That's
more
true.
sense,
There you
doesn't it? And then we have Pegita Mahmoudzadeh wrote, congratulations on the 100th episode of Roqe. Shout out to all the shining stars of Roqe Media Team. With no doubt, Mr. Faramars Aslani is one of the top Iranians' absolute musical legends.
Nice.
And then we have Behfour wrote, he might be the Leonard Cohen of Iran, but when he speaks English, he sounds like Christopher Walken of Iran too. Such a humble and down-to-earth artist. Really enjoyed the interview. Thanks to the Roqe team for another great job.
Nice.
And then we have John Cash 17 wrote, easily the best interview with Aslani in years. Well done, Jian. I have truly forgotten how extraordinary you are at your craft.
Thank you. Wait a minute. Forgotten? Why have you forgotten how extraordinary I am?
Well, he's remembered now.
That's very kind. I appreciate that.
Yeah. And then we have Letter of the Week.
Yeah, you're supposed to build anticipation.
It caught
blurt
me
it out like that.
It caught me off guard, to be honest. I was like, oh, we've arrived.
Letter of the week.
Oh, this week's Letter of the Week goes to Sheila Nahrvar.
Var, I think.
Nahrvar?
Nahrvar.
Nahrvar. Okay, so this week's Letter of the Week goes to Sheila Nahrvar. Thanks, Shaya. Thanks, Sheila.
Thanks, Sheila.
Thanks, Sheila and Shia.
All right. She says, congratulations to Roqe's professional team for achieving 100 episodes successfully. Such a great artist selection. Jian, your fascinating interview elicits a great deal of Faramars' insights that was quite intriguing to me. And for sure to all his fans. Great job. Very nice.
Thank you so much, Sheila. Thank you to all the... And thanks, she says, congratulations to Roqe's professional team. She hasn't met Captain Reza.
I think she's excluding Reza on that.
I like that we both go to Reza.
Poor Reza.
All right, that'll get you guys back.
You know, how does this happen, Reza? How do you become...
Next time on the next Abia.
That's right, that's right. If you stop the Abia...
It used to be me. I used to have Reza's job. Now it's moved on to him.
The chopped liver position?
Pretty much.
Listen, thank you to all you folks for writing. I know there were more letters too about Faramars Aslani. We really appreciate it when you guys comment on our stuff, and hope that you keep listening and become patrons at roqemedia.com. Thank you, the fabulous Kian, Captain Reza, Groovy Shy, the whole Roqe team. This is Full Time for Roqe for today. I should mention the names of that amazing team who put this show together each week. Savi Rohan, Thoughtful Nagin, Hanta the artist, producer Susan, the fabulous Kian, Aghay Mehdad, Master Muhammad, Captain Reza, and Groovy Shaya. Listen, thank you to all of you out there supporting us and becoming patrons, sharing our content, telling others about it. Please subscribe if you've not done so already. Just press subscribe on any of our platforms so you know about new episodes. Find me on Instagram at Jian Gomeshi. Have yourself a great few days. We'll see you Thursday. And Mizun Bashi.